Have you ever witnessed a moment so shocking, so dripping with abuse of power, that it forces you to question everything you thought you knew about justice? Today's story is one of those moments, an incident that began like an ordinary traffic stop, but spiraled into a confrontation so outrageous, it left an entire community stunned. Welcome back to Swift Tale, the channel where we dive deep into real stories that expose hidden truths, shake systems, and remind us why integrity matters. And if you're visiting for the very first time, I have one quick question for you. Have you liked, shared, and subscribed yet? If not, go ahead and tap those buttons so you never miss another breakdown of the stories that truly matter. Now let's get into why you're here. This is the unbelievable real-life account of a black woman who found herself being harassed by a dirty cop during what should have been a routine traffic stop. No speeding, no broken light, no erratic driving, nothing. Yet the officer approached the vehicle with hostility, arrogance, and clear prejudice, speaking to her in a tone no citizen, let alone a woman showing full compliance, should ever endure. She was belittled, intimidated, and talked down to for no reason other than the officer's unchecked ego and the uniform on his back. But what the officer didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, is that sitting right next to her in the passenger seat was her husband, the city's police chief. And that is where the story takes a wild turn. This isn't just a tale about one bad cop losing his temper. It's about racial profiling, abuse of authority, and the uncomfortable truth of how some officers behave when they think no one powerful is watching. It's about the moment arrogance collides with accountability. And most importantly, it's about what happens when the victim of harassment isn't powerless, not because of who she is, but because of who she happened to have beside her that day. This story matters because it exposes a system that too often protects the abuser instead of the abused. It shows us that racial bias isn't theoretical, it plays out in everyday encounters like this one. It forces us to confront the question, if this could happen to the wife of a police chief, what happens to people who have no one to defend them? Today, we're breaking down every detail, the officer's behavior, the shocking moment of realization, and the consequences that followed. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how a simple traffic stop turned into a career-shattering moment and sparked conversations across the community. So sit back, stay locked in, and get ready for a story that reveals the dangerous power of a badge misused, and the rare moment when that power meets its match. Before the confrontation that would shock an entire community, everything began in a quiet town that most people would describe as peaceful, almost too peaceful. It was the kind of place where everyone claimed to know everyone, where the rhythm of the day moved slowly, predictably, and without much chaos. On the surface, it seemed like the sort of town where trouble rarely visited, and where people believed they were insulated from the problems seen in larger cities. But beneath that calm exterior lay a complicated mix of unspoken tensions, old traditions, and a police department that had long been shielded by reputation rather than accountability. Locals had always viewed their police department as a symbol of old-school order, strict, structured, and respected. But if you listened closely to the conversations that took place behind closed doors, especially within the black community, a very different picture emerged. There were stories, plenty of them, of officers who treated certain residents differently, who let their badges grant them attitudes they would never dare show in the presence of someone with authority. Some residents shrugged it off as just the way things are here, while others felt a quiet but persistent fear every time blue lights flashed behind them. It wasn't loud enough to spark protests, but it was present enough to create a silent divide. Amid this environment lived the couple at the center of our story, a well-respected black woman known for her warmth, confidence, and leadership within several local organizations, and her husband, the newly appointed police chief. He was one of the few high-ranking black officials the department had ever seen, and his arrival had stirred both pride and resentment. Some officers admired him for his experience and integrity, others whispered bitterly that his reforms were changing things too fast. What the community saw as progress, certain officers viewed as a threat to their long-standing power dynamics. On the day of the incident, the couple wasn't rushing, arguing, or causing any disturbance. They were simply out running an errand, something as ordinary as picking up a package and grabbing a late lunch. The sun was out, the roads were clear, and nothing about the day hinted at the storm that was building quietly in the background. The woman drove while her husband sat in the passenger seat, reviewing messages on his phone, completely unaware that the next few minutes would alter the trajectory of one officer's career and expose a truth the town had avoided for too long. The officer who would soon pull them over had a reputation of his own, one that depended on who you asked. To his friends in the department, he was firm, commanding, and no-nonsense. But to many residents, especially residents of color, he was something very different. His stops were often aggressive, his tone always sharp, and his willingness to escalate situations felt almost habitual. There were quiet complaints, but nothing ever stuck, nothing ever changed. Whether out of loyalty, fear, or simple bureaucratic indifference, the department had allowed him to operate unchecked for years. As the couple's car rolled past the intersection near the old courthouse, the officer noticed them. He didn't see the police chief. He didn't recognize the vehicle. He didn't see a respected community advocate behind the wheel. What he saw, or more accurately what he assumed, was just another black driver he could treat however he wanted. And assumptions, especially in the hands of someone with authority, are often where injustice begins. Little did he know that in the next few minutes, he would make one of the most regrettable mistakes of his career. The town, the department, and his fellow officers had long ignored the whispers about his behavior, but after this day, after this specific traffic stop, there would be no more ignoring, no more shielding, and no more pretending. Everything was in place: the quiet road, the unassuming couple, and an officer who believed he was untouchable. The stage was set long before the lights flashed behind their car, and in that peaceful town, under that calm afternoon sun. The tension that had been gathering for years was finally about to erupt. The couple continued down the quiet stretch of road, completely unaware that the officer who had been sitting in his cruiser by the courthouse had already made up his mind about them. He pulled out slowly, almost casually, as though he were just merging into traffic. But within seconds, the lights on his patrol car flashed to life, sharp, blue, and authoritative against the calm afternoon. The woman driving noticed the lights in her rearview mirror and let out a soft sigh, confused but composed. She wasn't speeding, she hadn't run a light, and the car was in perfect condition. Still, she immediately signaled, pulled over to the shoulder, and came to a complete stop. Like any responsible driver, she prepared herself for a routine interaction, not realizing that the situation she was about to face would be anything but routine. Her husband, the police chief, looked up from his phone with mild surprise. Even he couldn't think of a reason why they would be pulled over. But he said nothing at first, choosing instead to observe. His decades of law enforcement experience had trained him to assess situations before reacting. He wanted to see how the officer approached, tone, posture, attitude. Sometimes the smallest details revealed the biggest truths. The officer stepped out of his vehicle with the kind of exaggerated authority that made it clear he enjoyed the power his badge gave him. His walk wasn't the steady, professional stride of someone enforcing the law. Instead, it carried a certain arrogance, a certain entitlement, as though he had already decided the couple was guilty of something, anything, and he simply needed to choose which accusation to throw at them. His hand hovered over his holster, not in caution, but in performance. It was unnecessary, but intentional, designed to intimidate. As he approached the driver's window, the woman rolled it down, offering the same respectful greeting she'd always given officers, regardless of the circumstances. "Good afternoon, officer," she said calmly, keeping both hands visible on the wheel, but the officer didn't respond with the same courtesy. Instead, his expression hardened, and his voice came out sharp, dismissive, almost hostile. Without offering a greeting of his own, he demanded her license and registration, not as a request, but as if issuing a command to someone he deemed beneath him. Something was off from the very start. He didn't state a reason for the stop. He didn't follow standard procedure. He didn't even attempt to make eye contact in a professional way. Everything about his tone suggested irritation, suspicion, and something darker, an attitude rooted less in protocol and more in prejudice. It was clear he had already decided how this stop would go, and none of it had anything to do with actual law enforcement. The woman tried to keep her voice steady as she asked the question any driver would. "Officer, may I know why I'm being pulled over?" Her question was met not with clarity, but with hostility. His jaw clenched, His eyes narrowed, and instead of providing an explanation, he shot back, "Don't question me, just hand over your information." His words weren't simply unprofessional. They were meant to belittle, to assert dominance, to remind her that he believed he was in control and that she had no right to speak. Her husband watched quietly, every muscle in his body tense but controlled. He had seen officers like this before, ones who thrived on intimidation rather than service, ones who believed the uniform made them superior rather than responsible, ones who forgot that the badge was not a weapon but a duty. But he continued to stay silent, giving the officer every chance to correct his behavior. It was a test he hoped the officer would pass, but deep down, he already sensed where things were heading. As the officer leaned slightly closer, peering into the car with an expression that mixed suspicion and disdain, the air inside the vehicle grew thick with tension. The woman remained polite, but her heartbeat quickened. The chief kept his eyes locked on the officer, saying nothing but observing everything. And the officer, blinded by his own arrogance, had no idea that the man watching him was someone who knew exactly how these stops were supposed to happen, and exactly how wrong this one already was. The stop had officially begun, but the officer's attitude had already set the tone. What might have been a simple interaction had turned into a moment charged with hostility, disrespect, and brewing danger. And with every word the officer spoke, it became clear that this encounter was about to escalate far beyond anything he expected. The officer's tone had already shifted the atmosphere inside the car, but what came next pushed the encounter into even more dangerous territory. Instead of processing the woman's license and registration like any standard traffic stop, he lingered at the window, staring her down with a look that carried more accusation than professionalism. It was as though he wanted her to feel uncomfortable, to sense that she was at his mercy, to believe she had no control over the unfolding situation. The woman maintained her composure, but her breathing grew slower, deeper, an instinctive attempt to stay calm in the face of escalating hostility. Without explanation, the officer demanded she step out of the vehicle. His voice was louder now, sharper, filled with an unnecessary edge that suggested he wasn't responding to any threat, he was creating one. The woman looked at him, stunned. "Step out. For what reason, officer?" she asked, her voice steady but strained. It was a reasonable question, especially since the officer had still not given any justification for the stop. But instead of answering, he took a step closer and barked, "I told you to get out of the car. Do it now." His hand pressed against the side of her door as though trying to exert physical control over the moment. Her husband, still in the passenger seat, shifted slightly, only enough for the officer to notice movement, but not enough to break his calm demeanor. The chief's voice remained steady as he spoke for the first time. "Officer, she has complied with everything you asked. What is the basis of this order?" His tone was not confrontational, but it was firm, seasoned, authoritative. It was the tone of someone used to chain-of-command protocol, but the officer didn't hear authority in that voice. He heard challenge. And challenges only seemed to inflame his ego. The officer shot his glare toward the passenger side, eyes narrowing at the chief, as if he were offended that anyone dared question him. "Sir, stay out of it. This doesn't concern you." His words dripped with disrespect. The chief's presence in the car wasn't just ignored, it was dismissed outright, as though he were just another civilian daring to question his power. The arrogance was staggering, and yet the officer continued without hesitation. Turning back to the woman, he repeated his demand, this time slamming his hand on the roof of the car to punctuate his authority. "Out, now." The sudden impact made her flinch, and it was at that moment the situation shifted from uncomfortable to unsafe. The officer wasn't just escalating, he was looking for a reaction, an excuse, something he could twist into justification for whatever he planned to do next. Every indicator, his body language, his increasing aggression, his refusal to explain, pointed to someone intoxicated by control. The woman slowly reached for her seatbelt, fingertips trembling, not out of guilt but out of fear. She knew that any sudden movement, any misinterpreted gesture, could give this officer the pretext he wanted. Her husband watched carefully, controlled but fiercely protective beneath the surface. He was torn between revealing his identity and allowing the officer one last opportunity to correct himself, to step back from this dangerous path. But the officer seemed determined to push further. Before she could unbuckle, he leaned forward aggressively and shouted, Are you refusing to obey a lawful order?" The accusation came quickly, almost eagerly, as though he had been waiting for any moment of hesitation to escalate the situation further. The woman, startled by his sudden volume, shook her head. "No, I'm not refusing. I'm just trying to understand." But he cut her off with a mocking laugh, the kind officers used when they believed they held absolute power. By now, cars passing on the opposite side of the road slowed down, drivers sensing the tension, some even pulling out their phones. The officer noticed but didn't care. If anything, the attention fueled him. He puffed out his chest, squared his shoulders, and projected the image of an officer in total control, even though anyone watching closely could see that he wasn't controlling the situation, he was provoking it. Inside the car, the air felt thick, heavy with fear and anger. The woman's pulse raced, her husband's jaw tightened, and the officer, completely unaware of who he was dealing with, seemed committed to pushing the confrontation to its breaking point. What should have been a simple, courteous interaction had now turned into a moment of intimidation, fear tactics, and blatant abuse of authority. And as the officer stood there, towering over the window with hostility radiating off him, he had no idea that his next actions would bring him face to face with a truth that would shatter his arrogance in an instant. The situation had already grown tense, but what happened next pushed the encounter into a place far beyond unprofessionalism. It entered the territory of undeniable harassment, behavior so reckless and so fueled by ego that even seasoned officers watching later would struggle to understand how one man could justify it. After barking at the woman repeatedly, the officer leaned closer into the window, invading her personal space with the unmistakable posture of someone trying to intimidate rather than enforce the law. His face was inches from hers now, his breath hot with frustration, and his eyes locked onto her with a glare that made her stomach twist. When she finally managed to unbuckle her seatbelt, the officer threw his hand inside the car, crossing the physical boundary he had no right to cross, and grabbed her wrist. It wasn't a firm, giddy grip or a controlled professional motion. It was aggressive, unnecessary, and meant to assert dominance. The woman gasped, her body instinctively pulling back, but the officer tightened his hold as if daring her to resist. "I said get out of the car," he growled, as though she had done something wrong simply by hesitating. Her husband reacted immediately, his voice deep and sharp, cutting through the tension. "Remove your hand from her." He didn't shout, but the authority in his tone was unmistakable. It was the kind of voice that demanded compliance, not from fear but from respect. Yet the officer ignored it. Perhaps he didn't hear past his own adrenaline. Perhaps he didn't care. Or perhaps he assumed wrongly that the man in the passenger seat was just another civilian he could steamroll without consequence. Instead of backing off, the officer escalated further. He yanked the woman's wrist up as though preparing to pull her out of the vehicle. The move was reckless, unnecessary, and blatantly abusive. Her husband's instincts flared. Every ounce of training, every year of leadership, every moment spent lecturing officers about restraint and professionalism clashed violently with the scene unfolding before him. His fists clenched, though he still held himself back with the discipline of a man trained to control situations rather than inflame them. The woman, now visibly shaken, stammered, "I'm not resisting, please stop." Her voice cracked under the weight of fear and humiliation, yet the officer twisted her words into something he could use. "That's not what it looks like," he muttered with a smirk, acting as though her compliance was defiance. He wanted a reaction, something he could justify, something he could write in a report, something that would let him continue the power trip he had engineered from the moment he turned on those lights. He finally released her wrist, only to step back and place his hand on his holster, not drawing his weapon, just resting on it. But for a black woman sitting in a car during a hostile traffic stop, that gesture alone was enough to send terror through her entire body. It was a threat disguised as procedure, a silent message that implied things could get much worse if she didn't play by his rules, rules he was inventing in real time. Her husband had seen enough. He knew exactly what that move meant. He had trained officers on the difference between readiness and intimidation, and everything about the officer's stance screamed the latter. The chief inhaled deeply, torn between revealing who he was and allowing the officer to expose just how corrupt his behavior truly was. But before he could speak again, the officer snapped, "If you don't get out right now, I'm placing you under arrest for obstruction." Obstruction, a charge thrown around by officers who had run out of legitimate reasons to justify their own actions. It was the ultimate tool of ego-driven policing, an accusation born not from law but from anger. Drivers passing by began slowing down again, some rolling down windows, others pulling out phones. The officer noticed, his jaw twitching with irritation, and he snapped at the woman, "You're making this harder on yourself." The irony was sharp, painful, and infuriating. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't refused. She hadn't done anything but ask a simple question: why had she been stopped? The officer had crossed the line, not just once, but repeatedly, violating procedure, boundaries, and basic human respect. And yet he pushed further, stepping into a level of aggression that most officers would never dream of using unless a situation justified it. This one didn't, but he didn't see that, because he didn't see her at all. He saw only who he assumed she was, a black woman he believed he could control, intimidate, and bully without consequence. But the consequence was sitting 2 feet away from him, witnessing every second. The officer had no idea his actions had just sealed his fate. No idea that the man he dismissed, the man he tried to silence, the man he ordered to stay out of it, was someone with the authority not only to hold him accountable, but to dismantle the very career he had built on intimidation. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. The officer stood there, hand on his holster, chest puffed out, ego swelling, convinced he had complete control over the situation. In his mind, this was just another stop where intimidation would win, where fear would silence questions, where power would go unchecked. But inside the car, the chief knew the moment had come. He had given this officer every opportunity to correct himself, every silent chance to step back into professionalism, every unspoken warning that his conduct was spiraling into dangerous territory. Yet the officer had ignored all of it, blinded by arrogance. And now, with his wife trembling beside him and a crowd beginning to gather, the chief's restraint reached its limit. He lowered his phone slowly, drawing the officer's attention. The chief's voice came out steady, low, calm, but with a steel edge that instantly changed the air between them. "Officer," he said, not raising his tone, "you need to step back from the vehicle right now." It wasn't a request. It wasn't a plea. It was a command delivered by someone accustomed to being obeyed. The officer scoffed and stepped closer, his arrogance flaring. "Sir, I told you once, stay out of this. I don't need commentary from the passenger seat." His words dripped with disdain, completely oblivious to who he was speaking to. He had no idea he was standing inches away from the one person in the entire department who could end his career with a single sentence. The chief exhaled slowly, fighting back the wave of anger threatening to break through his composure. He reached calmly into his jacket, not fast, not abrupt, but with the deliberate precision of a trained professional. The officer tensed, hand gripping his holster tighter, prepared to escalate even further. But before he could react, the chief pulled out his badge and held it up, angled toward the sunlight so there would be no mistaking what it was. The officer froze. For a moment, time itself seemed to halt. The badge gleamed, unmistakable, unforgiving, not a patrol badge, not a sergeant's badge, but the polished, unmistakable shield of the police chief. The officer's expression collapsed instantly, the arrogance drained from his face, replaced by confusion, then panic, then something close to dread. His jaw slackened, his eyes widened, his posture faltered. He took a step back, then another, as if trying to physically distance himself from the reality settling in around him. "Yes, sir," he stammered, his voice breaking. "Chief, I didn't realize." The chief didn't shout. He didn't threaten. His calmness was far more powerful than anger could ever be. "You didn't realize because you weren't paying attention," he said coldly, "and because you were too busy violating procedure to see the people in front of you." His words cut deeper than any raised voice could have. They carried authority, disappointment, and the heavy weight of truth. The officer swallowed hard, suddenly unsure what to do with his hands, his stance, his entire presence. He straightened instinctively, like a rookie caught breaking every rule on his first day. His eyes darted between the badge and the chief's face, searching for an excuse that didn't exist and forgiveness he had not earned. The chief continued, his voice unwavering. "You had no probable cause for this stop. You failed to state a reason for detaining the driver, You escalated without justification. You put your hands on a compliant civilian. You threatened arrest without basis, and you attempted to intimidate both of us. Every item he listed tightened the officer's throat a little more. The woman watched the officer's fear grow, the shift almost surreal. Moments earlier, this man had towered over her with hostility. Now he stood shrinking in place, unable to meet her eyes, stripped of the bravado that had fueled his behavior. The power dynamic flipped so suddenly it was impossible to ignore. The bully had finally realized he was not the biggest force in the room. I can explain, the officer stammered, desperation creeping into his voice, but the chief shut that down immediately. No, he said, voice firm, you will save your explanation for internal affairs. The officer's face drained of color. It was over, not the stop, not the consequences, not the fallout, but the illusion of invincibility that had fueled this officer's behavior, that was gone, broken, and in its place stood the undeniable truth. He had abused his power in front of the one person who knew exactly how to hold him accountable. The chief stepped out of the vehicle slowly, standing tall, authoritative, and unshakable. The officer stepped back like a man facing his own career in ruins. The watching drivers, the bystanders with their phones, the quiet witnesses, all of them saw the moment arrogance met justice. The officer had no idea his day would end like this. He thought he was dealing with ordinary citizens, people he could push around without consequence. Instead, he had harassed the wife of the police chief. And now, his reckless behavior was about to follow him into every report, every hearing, and every conversation about what happened on that quiet afternoon. He hadn't just crossed the line, he had crossed it in front of the one man who could erase it completely. The silence that followed the chief's revelation felt heavier than anything that had come before. The officer, who had moments earlier stood tall with the arrogance of unchecked authority, now looked like a man who had suddenly awakened from a nightmare, only to realize he was still living it. His breath came shallow, his face pale, and his hands twitched as he struggled to figure out what to do next. It was clear he had never expected consequences, let alone consequences delivered face to face by the highest-ranking officer in the department. The chief's wife rubbed her wrist gently, still shaken from the officer's aggressive grip. Now that the danger had eased, her adrenaline began to settle, making the trembling in her hands more noticeable. She wasn't just frightened, she was angry, humiliated, and exhausted all at once. But she held herself with dignity, refusing to let the officer see how deeply he had affected her. She looked at her husband, silently grateful he had stepped in before things escalated even further. The chief took a step forward, his presence commanding without a single raised word. He kept his eyes locked on the officer, who now stood several feet back, attempting to regain posture but failing miserably. "Holster your attitude and compose yourself," the chief said quietly, but the authority in his voice left no room for disobedience. The officer straightened stiffly, nodding in jerks, terrified of making another mistake. Just then, another patrol car pulled up. 2 additional officers stepped out, responding to what they thought was a routine backup call. But the moment they saw the chief standing outside the stopped vehicle, their expressions shifted from curiosity to confusion to immediate alertness. They approached cautiously, unsure of what they had just walked into. The problematic officer tried to wave them off quickly, stammering, it's handled, we're good here." The chief interjected sharply, "No, it is not handled." His voice reverberated with finality. The 2 arriving officers froze, instantly recognizing the gravity of the situation. Respectively, they greeted the chief and awaited instructions, their eyes flicking between him and their colleague with dawning concern. The chief's wife stepped out of the vehicle now, standing tall despite the shaking in her legs. One of the new officers glanced at her wrist, noticing the red marks beginning to form. His eyes widened with recognition. This was no simple misconduct. This was physical mishandling, harassment, and a blatant violation of protocol. His face hardened as he looked at the original officer, silently questioning how he could have allowed things to escalate this far. "Secure his weapon," the chief instructed calmly, not angrily, not emotionally. Just matter of fact, the way a superior speaks when delivering an order that cannot be challenged. The officer stiffened, his eyes widening further. Losing control of his weapon on scene wasn't just embarrassing, it was a symbolic stripping of trust. The backup officers hesitated only a moment before following orders. They approached their colleague carefully, then took his firearm with the precision of practiced protocol. The offending officer didn't resist. He couldn't. His face burned with shame as he handed over the weapon he had so casually relied on seconds earlier as a symbol of intimidation. Drivers continued to slow down. A few rolled down windows. Some whispered among themselves. The shift in power was palpable enough that even strangers felt it. The officer who moments earlier used fear as his currency was now visibly unraveling, undone not by violence or defiance, but by his own abuse of authority. Once his weapon was secured, the chief addressed everyone present. "This stop is over," he said firmly. "My wife and I will be leaving. A full report and formal internal review will be initiated immediately." There was no room for misunderstanding. The officers nodded, understanding the severity of his words. The offending officer swallowed hard, knowing his career, his reputation, and likely his future with the department hung by a thread. The chief escorted his wife back to the car, making sure she was safely inside before closing the door with deliberate care. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and raw emotion. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, offering reassurance without needing to say a word. As he walked around to the driver's side, he gave the officers one final look, a look that conveyed disappointment more than anger. Whether they felt it or not, they had all witnessed a defining moment, one that would echo through the department for months, maybe years. When the couple drove away, the road felt different. The sun hadn't changed, the surroundings hadn't shifted, but the weight that hung in the air confirmed that something irrevocable had occurred. The officer stood frozen on the shoulder, weaponless, powerless, and forced to confront the reality of his actions. The aftermath at the scene was more than just embarrassment for him. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The department moved quickly once word of the incident reached the station. By the time the chief and his wife arrived home, calls were already being made, emails were circulating, and the shift commander had initiated the required preliminary documentation. Within hours, the incident had shifted from a roadside confrontation to a full internal response. The officer involved was summoned back to the station for immediate debriefing. No one congratulated him. No one patted him on the back. Even his closest colleagues kept their distance, sensing the storm that was about to unfold. What had started as a routine stop had now become a serious question about conduct, credibility, and departmental oversight. The Internal Affairs Division launched a formal inquiry. This was not symbolic. It was procedural and mandatory. They began by reviewing the body cam footage, which captured the officer's tone, posture, words, and the exact moment he grabbed the woman's wrist. The footage also showed his reaction when he learned her husband was the chief, something that would make the department's legal and public relations teams pay extra attention. Body cam footage removed guesswork. It established fact. And the fact was simple. The officer had escalated a peaceful traffic stop without cause. Statements were gathered next. The chief provided his account, keeping his personal emotions out of the documentation. His wife gave a measured, factual testimony describing what happened without exaggeration. The two backup officers corroborated the sequence of events, confirming that the original officer seemed unusually agitated from the start and violated protocol. These statements formed a consistent picture. The department leadership understood the gravity. This wasn't just about one aggressive moment. It was about a pattern that might be hiding beneath the surface. Word of the incident spread internally. Officers whispered in hallways, shared snippets of body cam reviews, and questioned how a colleague had allowed himself to lose discipline so publicly. Some wondered if he had acted this way before. Others wondered why no one had reported it earlier. A few officers expressed frustration that it took the chief's wife being involved to bring real scrutiny. The situation exposed tension inside the department, tension that had always existed but rarely surfaced this clearly. Legal team, meanwhile, reviewed the footage with another concern in mind: liability. Anytime an officer puts hands on a civilian without reasonable justification, the department faces potential legal consequences. The chief's presence and rank didn't change the rules. If anything, it increased the pressure to handle the situation by the book. There could be civil complaints, union complications, and citizen review board inquiries. The department had no option except strict transparency. The union representative requested a meeting to discuss the officers' rights, disciplinary procedures, and the possibility of administrative leave. Such actions were standard in cases involving excessive force or misconduct. The department granted the request, but it was clear the investigation would not be softened or slowed. The chief made it known through official channels that he was recusing himself from all decision-making related to the case to ensure fairness. His name alone carried weight, and he refused to let that compromise the process. The officer was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. His badge and weapon were secured. Access to patrol vehicles and departmental systems was restricted. It was a temporary suspension of authority, but symbolically, it marked the collapse of the power he had misused. He left the station quietly, avoiding eye contact, his future uncertain and his reputation damaged. Behind the scenes, the department leadership drafted a preliminary press-ready statement. They anticipated public interest, especially once the story reached social platforms. They prepared language acknowledging the incident, confirming the investigation, and reinforcing the department's commitment to accountability. Nothing was released yet, but the groundwork was laid. This official response wasn't about protecting the chief. It was about protecting institutional integrity. The department understood that ignoring misconduct, especially now, would erode trust inside the force and among the public. The officer's actions had consequences not because of who the victim was, but because of what the job demands. The badge carries authority, but it also carries responsibility. In this case, responsibility had been neglected. Now the system was correcting course. The following morning, the entire police department buzzed with a tension that everyone felt, but no one spoke about directly. Rumors had already begun circulating, whispers of a late-night incident, a heated confrontation, and a patrol officer who had apparently crossed a line far worse than anyone initially understood. Reporters gathered outside the precinct before sunrise, sensing that something big was about to break. Cameras, microphones, and news vans crowded the sidewalks, as if waiting for the opening scene of a drama that the whole city would soon be watching. Inside the building, officers and administrative staff moved with an unusual stiffness, trying to appear focused while clearly glancing toward the chief's office, wondering when he would emerge and what he would say. Some feared the worst, a scandal that would paint the department in the darkest possible light. Others felt a quiet hope. Maybe, finally, someone was going to address the misconduct that too often went unspoken. The chief's presence that morning was unmistakable. When he stepped out of his office, the hallway grew silent, officers standing straighter, conversations halting instantly. He walked to the podium set up in the lobby, the glass doors behind him allowing the crowd of reporters outside to see every move he made. His expression wasn't angry or emotional. It was resolute, like a man who understood the weight of what he was about to say and the responsibility he carried for every word. When the doors opened and he stepped out into the flashes of cameras, the crowd surged forward, every microphone extending toward him like hungry hands. "Good morning," he began, his voice calm but commanding. "Yesterday, an incident occurred involving one of our officers during what should have been a routine traffic stop." He paused, letting the words settle. No euphemisms, no soft phrasing. The city needed to hear the truth plainly. He continued, "That officer behaved in a manner that violated department policy, violated the expectations of this community, and violated the basic principles of respect and human dignity that this department is meant to uphold." The reporters scribbled furiously, their cameras capturing every word. The chief didn't shield the department, nor did he attempt to justify the officer's behavior. Instead, he acknowledged it head-on. "The person he harassed was my wife," he said, the sentence landing like a thunderclap. The crowd erupted with questions, but the chief raised a hand. "Let me be clear, this statement is not about my position. It is not about my family. It is about accountability." He explained, step by step, how the officer would face an internal investigation, how his weapon had been removed at the scene, and how the department would pursue disciplinary action based on the findings. There was no attempt to downplay the situation. He didn't stop there. He addressed the broader issue one many leaders avoid. Incidents like this do not happen in isolation. They are part of a larger problem within policing nationwide. We must face this truth if we expect our communities to trust us. The badge is not a shield for misconduct. It never has been, and it never will be under my leadership. The reporters were stunned. Some expected a political rehearsed speech. Instead, they got honesty, rare, unfiltered honesty from a police chief willing to expose flaws within his own institution. "We serve a diverse community," he said, "and it is unacceptable for any officer to treat any citizen differently because of bias, assumptions, or abuse of power. My wife was not targeted because she is my spouse. She was targeted because she is a black woman." And that is the uncomfortable truth we cannot ignore. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras zoomed in closer. His words were bold, strong enough to spark conversation far beyond the city limits. "This department will not move forward by pretending we are perfect. We will move forward by facing where we have failed." When he finally ended his statement, stepping back from the podium, the noise surged again, the rush of questions, the frantic clicking of cameras, the realization that a story of national significance had just unfolded. But the chief didn't stay to entertain questions. He had said what needed to be said. And in that moment, he set a tone not just for the investigation, but for the future of the entire department. Behind him, officers watched silently, some with pride, others with discomfort, and a few with fear, because they understood what his words truly meant. Change was no longer optional. Accountability would no longer be negotiable. And the truth, once spoken publicly, could not be buried again. The incident didn't end at the roadside. Once the couple returned home, the wheels of accountability began turning at a pace the officer could never have anticipated. Within hours, reports of the traffic stop had circulated among the department's upper echelons. Internal Affairs was notified immediately, and the chief made sure that every detail, every aggressive word, every improper maneuver, and every violation of protocol was documented with precision. The officer, who had moments earlier wielded his badge as a weapon of intimidation, now found himself under scrutiny, every move he had made dissected by a panel trained to evaluate misconduct without bias. The formal investigation was thorough. Bodycam footage, dashcam recordings, and witness statements were reviewed repeatedly. Every aggressive gesture, every raised voice, every moment of physical intimidation was catalogued meticulously. The officer's explanations, desperate, awkward, and inconsistent, failed to justify any of his behavior. The disciplinary board, made up of senior officials, noted that not only had he violated department policy, but he had endangered a civilian and brought the department into disrepute. His claim that he had acted out of caution held no weight in the face of indisputable evidence showing excessive force and harassment. Civil authorities soon became involved. Because the victim was the spouse of the police chief, the case received heightened attention, but it also highlighted the structural protections often afforded to officers in such cases. Still, the investigation proceeded with a transparency that would be the exception rather than the rule in most situations. Legal experts analyzed the case, citing clear breaches of both civil and criminal law, including harassment, unlawful detention, and abuse of authority. The officer faced the real possibility of criminal charges, alongside internal disciplinary action, a dual threat that made even his seasoned lawyer uneasy. Internally, the department began deliberating over the officer's fate. Suspension without pay was immediate. Investigators recommended termination. Citing not just the severity of the incident, but the officer's documented history of complaints. Letters, emails, and prior incident reports painted a picture of a man who had repeatedly overstepped boundaries. The officer's colleagues, some sympathetic, some silently relieved, watched as the once feared officer was stripped of authority, credibility, and trust. Even for those officers accustomed to seeing misconduct swept under the rug, this level of accountability was unprecedented. Public opinion weighed heavily as well. News outlets reported the facts. An aggressive officer had harassed a civilian during a traffic stop, and the civilian's husband, the city's police chief, had intervened. The media attention, coupled with social media scrutiny, created a storm that the department could not ignore. Citizens demanded justice, transparency, and evidence that lessons would be learned. The officer's name, once spoken with casual authority, became a subject of scrutiny, debate, and, in some circles, ridicule. Ultimately, the officer faced formal disciplinary hearings. Testimonies were taken, evidence reviewed, and procedural safeguards observed. The outcome was decisive. He was terminated from the department. Any possibility of reinstatement was blocked by a unanimous ruling that highlighted the gravity of his misconduct. Legal advisors confirmed that his actions could also expose him to civil liability, ensuring that accountability extended beyond just losing a job. For the chief and his wife, the resolution brought a complex mix of relief and reflection. Justice had been served in one sense, but the broader implications of the incident lingered. They recognized that, for many civilians, such accountability remained rare, and that systemic issues in policing persisted far beyond a single officer. Nonetheless, the episode demonstrated that corruption and abuse of authority could be challenged, and that the courage to intervene, combined with proper procedural follow-through, could yield tangible results. The legal and disciplinary consequences of that day rippled through the department, the community, and beyond. They became a case study in the perils of unchecked power, the importance of internal accountability, and the critical role that integrity, courage, and oversight play in law enforcement. For the officer, it was the end of a career built on intimidation. For the couple and their community, it was a moment that proved that even entrenched systems could be held accountable when confronted with the truth. As the story spread beyond the quiet streets of the town, it quickly captured the attention of local and national media alike. Reporters pounced on the narrative, a routine traffic stop gone horribly wrong, a harassed black woman, and the shocking revelation that her husband, the city's police chief, was in the car. Headlines screamed of corruption, abuse of power, and the irony of a police officer harassing the spouse of someone who literally oversaw the department. Within hours, social media was flooded with videos, statements, and commentary, creating a whirlwind that no one, least of all the officer involved, could ignore. News outlets dissected every detail, replaying bodycam footage, quoting witnesses, and analyzing the officer's conduct against departmental policies. Panel discussions debated not only the individual incident, but the broader issues it exposed: racial profiling, unchecked authority, and the culture of silence within some law enforcement agencies. Experts weighed in, some praising the chief for his calm intervention, others critiquing systemic failings that allowed the officer's behavior to escalate unchecked in the first place. The story became a lens through which citizens examined law enforcement as a whole, raising uncomfortable questions about fairness, accountability, and trust. Social media amplified the outrage. Citizens shared screenshots, posted commentary, and uploaded clips from local broadcasts. Influencers and activists weighed in, framing the incident as both a cautionary tale and a call to action. Hashtags circulated, trending regionally and nationally, emphasizing the need for reform and highlighting the stark imbalance in how power is wielded on the streets. People debated, if a police chief's spouse could be harassed without consequence at first, what chance did ordinary civilians have in similar encounters? The narrative struck a nerve because it reflected the reality many had feared but rarely witnessed firsthand. Public forums and local meetings became heated. Residents voiced frustration, anger, and incredulity. Town hall discussions, police accountability committees, and community councils all revisited procedures, training practices, and disciplinary measures. Citizens demanded transparency and fairness, pressing leaders for answers and tangible reforms. Even those who initially defended the officer were forced to acknowledge that his conduct was indefensible and that the chief's intervention was not just appropriate, but necessary. The media coverage also sparked debate about the role of power and privilege in policing. Commentators pointed out the uncomfortable irony. The officer, emboldened by a badge and presumed authority, had overstepped with someone he assumed had no influence, only to confront the highest-ranking official in the department. This revelation served as a powerful metaphor for accountability, demonstrating that authority is not absolute and that misconduct, even when seemingly concealed, can be exposed in dramatic, undeniable ways. Yet the coverage didn't stop at outrage and analysis. Many journalists used the story as a springboard to explore broader social issues: racial inequality in law enforcement, patterns of harassment during routine traffic stops, and the need for reforms to prevent abuse of power. The incident became a case study in multiple publications, not only documenting the confrontation itself, but examining its implications for policy, community trust, and the relationship between civilians and police officers. By the end of the week, the story had reached far beyond the town where it began. Public debate surged across forums, television segments, and online communities. Citizens, officials, and media outlets alike were forced to confront uncomfortable truths. And while the officer faced disciplinary action, the broader conversation sparked by his behavior continued to ripple through society, reminding everyone that individual actions, especially those fueled by arrogance and prejudice, can have consequences far beyond the immediate moment. This widespread media coverage solidified the incident as more than a personal confrontation. It became a cultural touchpoint, a story that would be referenced in discussions about police accountability for months, even years. It illustrated the power of transparency, the influence of social and digital media, and the importance of community oversight. Above all, it made clear that moments of injustice, when exposed and addressed, could spark debate, reflection, and ultimately change. The aftermath of that fateful traffic stop extended far beyond legal and disciplinary consequences. It penetrated deeply into the personal lives of the couple involved. For the woman, the incident left a lingering sense of vulnerability and disbelief. Although she had acted calmly during the encounter, the memory of the officer's aggression and verbal harassment haunted her. Every time she drove past the spot where the stop occurred, her chest tightened, her mind replaying the hostile tone, the unnecessary threats, and the physical intimidation. It was a stark reminder that even in her own community, she could be targeted simply for who she was. The experience challenged her sense of safety, leaving her to reconcile the terrifying reality that power could so easily be misused. Her husband, the police chief, also felt the weight of the incident on both professional and personal levels. While he had intervened decisively at the scene, he could not escape the discomfort of realizing that one of his officers had so flagrantly violated trust and procedure under his leadership. The responsibility of accountability weighed heavily on him, and he grappled with the dual challenge of supporting his wife while enforcing standards within his department. Even with his authority, the realization that the abuse could have escalated into physical harm caused sleepless nights, replayed conversations, and reflections on the very nature of policing and oversight. Together, the couple faced the public eye in ways they had never anticipated. Media attention brought support from many, but also criticism and scrutiny. Friends, neighbors, and community members reached out, offering empathy, solidarity, and encouragement, while strangers online dissected the incident, sometimes harshly. The couple had to navigate not only their private emotions, but the public perception of their experience. Every statement, every interview, every social media post was weighed carefully, balancing honesty, composure, and the potential influence on the ongoing investigation. It was a delicate dance between personal healing and public accountability. Emotionally, the woman experienced a mixture of anger, relief, and lingering trauma. Relief that her husband was there, that the officer was held accountable, that her dignity was ultimately defended. Anger that she had been subjected to harassment in the first place, and that her everyday reality as a black woman made her vulnerable to such treatment. And trauma, a subtle but persistent undercurrent, reminding her that power imbalance and prejudice were real, ever-present, and often unpredictable. Processing these feelings required deep reflection, support from loved ones, and time, none of which could erase the intensity of the encounter, but could help her regain a sense of agency. The chief also reflected on broader implications. Beyond protecting his wife, he realized that the incident served as a crucial lesson for his department, highlighting systemic issues that needed immediate attention. It strengthened his resolve to implement reforms, to emphasize training, and to ensure accountability mechanisms were not merely theoretical. Yet even as a leader, he could not completely insulate himself from the personal shock of seeing someone abuse authority in his own jurisdiction, under his own supervision. The juxtaposition of professional duty and personal defense created a unique, ongoing challenge that would influence both his approach to leadership and his understanding of community trust. For the couple, the incident became a shared experience of resilience. It tested the bonds of their relationship, reinforced their mutual trust, and highlighted the importance of solidarity in confronting injustice. They discovered a new depth of patience, communication, and courage, learning to navigate not only the immediate danger, but the emotional fallout that extended far beyond the roadside. While they could not control public reaction or the actions of others, they could control how they supported each other, responded to scrutiny, and channeled the experience into advocacy, awareness, and reflection. Ultimately, the personal impact of that day extended into every facet of their lives. Driving, interacting with law enforcement, speaking in public forums, and even engaging in casual community events were all subtly reshaped by the memory of the stop. And yet, within that challenge lay a profound opportunity to bear witness, to share truth, and to demonstrate that courage and integrity could prevail, even in the face of intimidation, abuse, and systemic imbalance. While the traffic stop itself was a singular event, the lessons it revealed extend far beyond one car, one officer, and one family. At its core, this story illuminates the dangers of unchecked authority and the consequences when power is abused. The officer's behavior was not simply unprofessional. It was a vivid example of how systemic issues can manifest in everyday interactions, often targeting those who are already vulnerable. Racial bias, whether conscious or unconscious, played a role in the escalation, underscoring the persistent challenges faced by communities of color in encounters with law enforcement. This incident forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, that privilege, position, and power can distort judgment, that protocols are meaningless without enforcement, and that human dignity can be threatened even in the most ordinary moments. Another critical theme is accountability, both personal and systemic. The officer, emboldened by his perceived authority, believed he could act without consequence. Yet, when faced with a situation where oversight was immediate and unavoidable, his misconduct was exposed. This demonstrates a fundamental truth about leadership and responsibility. When authority is wielded carelessly, it is not just the victim who suffers, it is the entire system, which loses credibility, public trust, and moral legitimacy. The police chief's intervention, calm but decisive, serves as a reminder that oversight matters, that courage can disrupt cycles of abuse, and that integrity in leadership can restore order where chaos and arrogance once thrived. The story also highlights the emotional and social dimensions of injustice. Harassment, intimidation, and abuse leave psychological scars that persist long after the physical threat has passed. For the woman, the trauma was compounded by societal factors: her vulnerability as a black woman, the aggression of someone sworn to protect the public, and the sudden, public exposure of her ordeal. For the chief, there was the dual responsibility of protecting his family and maintaining professional standards. Illustrating the complexity of navigating personal and systemic accountability simultaneously. These human elements remind viewers that injustice is not abstract, it is lived, felt, and remembered. Furthermore, this incident serves as a case study in the role of public scrutiny and media in enforcing accountability. The viral spread of information, the scrutiny of social media, and the engagement of journalists created a pressure that ensured the officer could not simply hide behind bureaucracy. The story reveals how transparency, community awareness, and active engagement can be powerful tools for reform. When the public pays attention, when citizens demand answers, the structures of power are compelled to respond. In this sense, the incident becomes not just about one stop, but about a society grappling with fairness, trust, and the ethical responsibilities of those entrusted with authority. Ultimately, the lessons from this encounter extend to everyday life. It reminds us to question assumptions, to stand up against abuse, and to recognize the difference between authority exercised responsibly and power wielded recklessly. It challenges communities, institutions, and individuals alike to reflect on how biases, protocols, and interpersonal dynamics intersect, and how courage, integrity, and vigilance can prevent harm before it escalates. While the traffic stop was a single moment, the ripple effects continue, teaching lessons about justice, accountability, and the transformative power of principled intervention. This story also highlights resilience. The couple's ability to remain composed, to support each other, and to respond with dignity under pressure exemplifies the strength that individuals can summon in the face of intimidation. It illustrates how moments of personal courage can catalyze broader systemic reflection and change. In every sense, the incident is a microcosm of society's ongoing struggle with fairness, authority, and human decency, reminding us that even in the darkest moments, clarity, courage, and accountability can prevail. In the weeks and months following the incident, the story slowly moved from immediate shock to concrete resolution, both within the department and in the lives of those involved. The officer, once brimming with confidence and a sense of untouchable authority, faced the full consequences of his actions. Internal Affairs completed its investigation, and his termination was finalized, his career in law enforcement effectively over. Legal experts noted that his actions could expose him to civil liabilities, creating repercussions that extended far beyond a single disciplinary action. What began as a roadside confrontation had transformed into a comprehensive reckoning, illustrating that abuse of power could no longer be hidden behind the veneer of a uniform. For the couple, the resolution brought a complex mixture of relief, reflection, and renewed purpose. The woman, though still carrying the emotional weight of the encounter, began the process of reclaiming her sense of safety and agency. The public attention, while intense, became a platform for her to speak about the importance of accountability and dignity in the face of harassment. Her husband, meanwhile, used the incident to reinforce a culture of professionalism within the department, pushing for stricter oversight, additional training, and more robust mechanisms for reporting misconduct. The experience, though harrowing, had strengthened their bond and clarified their commitment to integrity both personally and professionally. Community response also played a pivotal role in the aftermath. Citizens, previously hesitant to question law enforcement, saw a clear example of accountability in action. Local forums, town hall meetings, and social media discussions all reflected a newfound willingness to engage with issues of policing and systemic bias. The chief's decisive intervention and the department's response sent a message that misconduct would be addressed, setting a precedent that encouraged dialogue and transparency. For many residents, it was a rare moment in which trust, though shaken, began to be restored through visible action and clear consequences. The officer's colleagues were left to grapple with the incident and its broader implications. Even those who had been sympathetic or indifferent to past complaints recognized that the stakes had shifted. Accountability was no longer optional, and the culture of fear and silence that had allowed misconduct to persist began to erode. The incident became a case study within the department, cited during trainings, policy reviews, and leadership discussions as a stark example of what happens when personal bias and unchecked authority intersect with professional responsibility. In the wider media and public discourse, the story gradually settled into a lasting narrative about power, oversight, and societal responsibility. Journalists, activists, and academics referenced the incident as evidence of the complex challenges faced by law enforcement and the communities they serve. It became not just a story about a single traffic stop, but a lens for examining larger systemic issues: racial profiling, abuse of authority, and the role of accountability in maintaining public trust. For the couple, life eventually returned to a sense of normalcy, though nothing could entirely erase the memory of that afternoon. They remained active in their community, using their experience to advocate for reform and awareness. The woman, strengthened by her ordeal, spoke openly about the emotional and psychological impacts of harassment. The chief continued to push for departmental improvements, ensuring that the lessons learned were institutionalized, not just personal. Ultimately, the resolution of this story serves as a reminder that justice, while sometimes delayed, is possible. It demonstrates that even the most ordinary moments, like a routine traffic stop, can expose profound truths about power, responsibility, and human behavior. And it leaves a lasting message that courage, integrity, and vigilance can transform a moment of injustice into a catalyst for accountability, awareness, and positive change. As we wrap up this story, it's impossible not to reflect on the powerful lessons it offers. A traffic stop that began as a routine interaction escalated into a confrontation fueled by unchecked authority and bias, but it also became a testament to courage, accountability, and the importance of standing up for what is right. The bravery of the woman, the decisive action of the police chief, and the subsequent consequences for the officer remind us that power must always be balanced by responsibility, and that integrity can prevail even in moments of intimidation and fear. This story isn't just about one officer's misconduct. It's about the broader lessons it teaches society about fairness, justice, and the role each of us can play in holding systems accountable. For the community, for the department, and for the couple themselves, the incident sparked reflection, dialogue, and reform. It showed that harassment and abuse of power are never acceptable and that transparency and accountability are essential in maintaining trust. It also highlighted the emotional and psychological impact that such encounters can have, reminding us that every interaction with authority carries weight and consequences. By paying attention, speaking out, and demanding accountability, ordinary people can contribute to meaningful change and ensure that justice is not only a concept, but a lived reality. Here at Swifttail, we aim to bring you stories like this, stories that uncover the truth, challenge assumptions, and illuminate the real-life consequences of actions and decisions. If this story resonated with you and you want to support our channel, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that exposes the unexpected, the courageous, and the impactful. And we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts, your experiences, or how you think accountability and integrity should be enforced in situations like this. Your voice matters, and together we can spark meaningful conversations that go beyond the screen. This story is a reminder that even in moments of injustice, change is possible. Even in situations where intimidation seems overwhelming, courage and integrity can shift the balance. It encourages all of us to stay vigilant, stand up for what is right, and recognize that accountability is not just a concept, it is a responsibility we share. Thank you for joining us at Swifttail to explore this remarkable story. Your support allows us to continue bringing these powerful, real-world narratives to light. Remember, every action has a consequence, every voice has power, and together we can make a difference.